I'm here to first introduce Rosa DeLauro, my friend, and a congresswoman representing Connecticut's 3rd District in the U.S. House for over 2 decades. Rose has devoted her career to fighting for working families. She's fought, and I know because I've fought alongside her for part of that time, for raising the minimum wage, giving employees access to sick days, and allowing workers to take family and medical leave. She's been passionate on issues of equal pay for equal work. She's been fighting recently tooth and nail to protect the ACA for fair trade. I will tell you something you may not know about Rose, is that if she has your cell phone number, she will call you. Nutrition, and getting to the point of today's conversation, she's been working on this issue of child allowance, or at least a fully refundable tax credit, which is pretty equivalent, for many years. She is not a newcomer to this debate. And in fact, people may not know this. A great little trivia point for those in the child allowance world is that thanks to Rosa, the Congress actually voted on an amendment in 2003. I'm old enough to remember, on a fully refundable child tax credit, and then the amendment failed. But that was the only time, to my knowledge, that our Congress ever even voted on a child allowance. And she currently has legislation, I think it's H.R. 4963, if I recall, that creates a fully refundable CTC with a supplement of $1,500 per kids for all children under 3, with incomes up to the child tax credit limits. And according to our analysis at the Center on Budget, that would lift nearly 8 million people, including over 2 million kids under age 3, above or closer to the poverty line. So this is not someone who just talks the talk, she walks the walk. Rosa, please talk to us.
Thanks so much. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Jared. What you didn't say is that when I do ring the number, you answer the phone, and you're always there. So I'm much appreciative of that. And I've often had to say, Jared, I'm not stalking you, but please, I need your help in this effort. I think what I want to say is, and maybe I shouldn't say this to start out with, is that I voted in 1996 on the welfare bill, and I will just tell you that I voted against it, and it's one of the proudest votes I've cast in the 26 years that I've served in the House of Representatives. So I think I need to set that record out there. And Jared, I thank you again for moderating this discussion, and I want to thank you for the great work that you do, and really one of the foremost thought leaders on economic policy that, in fact, do improve the lives of working Americans. I also want to recognize Ron Haskins and Jane, groundbreaking work on this topic, and have paved the way for so many of the excellent conversations that were held today. The policy solutions discussed today provide a constructive frame for members of Congress to approach the issue of a universal child allowance or the expansion of child tax credits. And I am sure that it has been a productive and a thought-provoking day, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to be able to speak with you. I believe that Jane mentioned in her welcome this afternoon that today's conference is a fitting bookend to a similar conference that was held 50 years ago. In 1967, the Columbia University School of Social Work held a Children's Allowances Conference. It convened experts in social welfare and economics with policymakers to ensure that the issue of child allowances was given, and I quote, serious review at this time. This should drive the point home that this is not a new or a novel idea. Far from it. We have been having this conversation in some form or another for 50 years, at least. In 1991, Senator Jay Rockefeller chaired a comprehensive bipartisan commission on child and family policy, which explored a fully refundable child tax credit. In fact, it was on May 1st in 1991, exactly 26 years ago, that the Commission unanimously approved a proposal which included a fully refundable child tax credit of $1,000 in 1991 dollars. And we have folks who are in the audience here today, people who worked as staff on both sides of the aisle on that commission. So the goals of this conference are not new, but we do have the benefit today of drawing from new and compelling research from our presenters on both the economic and health sides of this question. Their work makes clear we need to invest in our youngest citizens. This is the key to reducing child poverty, which is a critical commitment to working families and to our values. Our economy is more competitive when every child is empowered to meet his or her full potential. And yet, the United States spends just 1.2% of GDP on family benefits, less than half of the average of other advanced economies. Other countries are doing far more to help working families, and the results speak for themselves. Among the 35 industrialized nations, the U.S. ranks 34th in relative child poverty. This betrays our social priorities and our values. Universal child allowances are a reality in nearly all other industrialized nations, but not in the United States. Around the world, these benefits are delivered monthly to families to help cover recurring costs. Countries, Austria, Canada, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom have all implemented some form of the monthly child benefit. And whether they come through, quote, child allowances or through the tax code as child tax credits, their impact cannot, in my view, be overstated. Just last week, Vox ran a thorough piece on child poverty in the United States and how a universal child allowance or a tax credit could combat it simply and effectively. Let me digress for 1 second. In the piece last week, Vox wrote that a murderer's row of poverty experts, including many people in this room, have proposed a child allowance as an anti-poverty measure. Murderer's row, of course, some of you baseball fans will know this, were the New York Yankees. Their starting lineup in the 1920s, particularly 1927, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Tony Lazzeri, and so on. So it is a fitting analogy for the scholars and the experts that we have working on this issue. I apologize to you Red Sox fans for this effort. But seriously, we have a moral obligation. We have a moral obligation to elevate this issue and to fight child poverty with every available resource. And this brings to mind a quote from Robert Kennedy, which I think is very fitting. I believe that as long as there is plenty, poverty is evil. Government belongs wherever evil needs an adversary, and there are people in distress who cannot help themselves. According to research by the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University's School of Social Work, 56% of children are, quote, low income, as compared to 43% of adults 18 through 64. Families with young children bear the heaviest burden. Infants and toddlers are among the poorest members of American society, with almost half living in low-income families. And while families across the board have been facing a financial squeeze, child-related costs have skyrocketed in recent years. The cost of childcare, the cost of education, the cost of housing, the cost of health care. for nuanced reasons from lack of government funding to insufficient daycare staffing. In fact, child-related costs represent nearly 70% of the rising costs associated with the pillars of middle-class economic security since 2000. We have an obligation. We have an obligation to do what we can to help households cope with these rising costs, especially as wages fail to rise with them. Economists have found that families with young children receive the smallest tax credits. Poor young children are nearly 50% more likely to be ineligible for the full child tax credits than older children because their families earn too little. This runs counter to what we know from child development experts and economists on the importance of cash in the earliest years. There's a mountain of literature and research that supports the notion that these families are the ones who would reap the most benefits. The Council of Economic Advisors estimates that combined local, state, and federal annual expenditure in 2015 was 63% higher per child for children between the ages of 6 and 11 versus those who are ages 3 to 5. Our existing policies leave significant gaps during the first years of a child's life. We need to focus our efforts on supporting families and children in the first years of life. Study after study has shown the dire consequences that poverty can have on a child's future. Children who grow up poor are more likely to drop out of school, experience health problems, become involved with the criminal justice system, and live their adulthood in poverty. And evidence suggests that when we invest in early childhood development, we can turn those trends around. The child tax credit was created in 1997 to help working families afford the expenses related to raising children. Together, the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit lift more children out of poverty than any other federal policies. The child tax credit alone is responsible for lifting approximately 2.8 million people out of poverty, including 1.6 million children, according to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, their analysis of the U.S. Census Supplemental Poverty Measure. We've made great strides recently with the expansion of the EITC and the child tax credit. But if we indexed the credit to inflation, we could support more families. We could support more children. You know, we have managed at the federal level to index the estate tax for the wealthiest Americans in this country, but we have left out our children. And because the benefits of the child tax credit are based on earnings, we leave behind many of our youngest children who are the most likely to be living in families that are too poor to receive the full credit. We have the evidence. Now we need to align the science with the need and enact the appropriate public policy initiatives and have the will to do it, which is why I have proposed the Child Tax Credit Improvement Act. I don't know what the number is on the act. The Child Tax Credit Improvement Act would increase the value of the child tax credit for families with young children under the age of 6 to $3,600. It would look to distribute the credit in regular monthly payments. It has no earnings requirement and no phase-in and is fully refundable. The bill would improve the child tax credit for older children as well by allowing every dollar of earnings to count towards the credit, to triple the phase-in rate to allow low-income working families to be able to receive the full credit. The bill would finally index the value of the child tax credit with inflation, keeping the credit's value from continuing to erode over time. This is a universal credit, which is critical for the families with the most need, where a parent may be staying home or may be out of work. You know, there are proposals on the other side of the aisle as well, but with some of them, they only apply to working parents. This credit would give more parents an economic boost during a child's critical development years, a time when parental incomes tend to be lower, costs of childbearing tend to be higher, and family income matters most for kids for their long-term outcome. The Century Foundation's report, quote, "Doing More for Our Children," found that giving families with younger children a larger credit would be more cost-effective and lift a larger percentage of children out of poverty than simply expanding the child tax credit. And Dr. T. Berry Brazelton, America's pediatrician, called the idea, and I quote, "a dose of economic protection for children," and said that, quote, "healthy economics may be one of the best remedies of all for children and babies across our country." These changes would also have a profound effect on families who are living in deep poverty. In 2011, 4% of U.S. households were living on $2 or less in cash income per day. I know you've heard from Kathy this afternoon, her book with Luke Schaefer, who is here today, as well as one of the proposal's authors. $2 a day living on almost nothing in America should be required reading for all policy makers. For these families living in deep poverty, the current tax system does little to assist them because of income thresholds. The Child Tax Credit Improvement Act would benefit these families enormously. In fact, it would end $2 a day poverty among families with young children. If we are serious about reducing poverty, giving every child the opportunity to succeed in this country, we need a child allowance, or we need a tax credit that is fully refundable and larger than the existing tax credit. That is why the Child Tax Credit Improvement Act focuses on the investment in families with the youngest children, children under age 6, because they have the greatest need. These benefits are particularly critical to rural families, according to the United States Department of Agriculture, their paper on federal tax policies and low-income rural households. And this is because children in rural areas are poorer on average, and they are further away from other services. The panel you held today on why money matters highlighted why cash has an outsized positive impact on these families. The proposal that I've introduced would also help parents who stay at home, those with erratic work schedules, and parents who need flexibility most, who are left out of some of the Republican plans that exclude the poorest families. Our children's future is our collective responsibility. But providing children with the resources they need to succeed is not just a moral obligation, it is an economic imperative. This is a rare moment where we have a real opportunity to translate scientific and economic evidence into policy that positively impacts the lives that people are actually living today. There is bipartisan interest in this kind of policy in the Congress today. There are Republican proposals to expand the child tax credit. Marco Rubio, Mike Lee. And there is a history of bipartisan support for these kinds of credits. The child tax credit was introduced in the Republican Contract with America in 1994 and first became law under a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, and a GOP Congress in 1997. If you look at the history of the Earned Income Tax Credit, it has had support from Democrats and Republicans. And now, as there are many conversations taking place about taxes, surely there can be and should be room for our youngest and our most vulnerable children and families to be included. Last week, the Trump administration rolled out an outline of their tax proposal. And while it is not fully fleshed out, it is clear, okay, that this proposal will not help families with the most need. The biggest challenge that faces our country today is that people are in jobs that just don't pay them enough money. Families do not make enough money to live on. All of our policies should share the goal of reducing the burden on working families and on investing in the future. Again, the policies have bipartisan interest. In the past, when this country has faced serious issues, we have come together in a bipartisan fashion, and we now have the evidence to make our case. This fight is different than others because the biggest obstacle has not been lies or obstructionism, but it has been indifference to the condition of children, and particularly poor children. And it's enough. The time has come for tax credits that help families with young children because it is long overdue. We need to do it, and your engagement, everyone in this room, in the policy making and in the legislative process is imperative. Don't stop at the door of the policy. Understand that it goes nowhere unless there is a legislative process that makes it operational. So I look forward to your participation. I look forward to our discussion, and thank you for allowing me to be with you. Thank you. Okay, Barry.
All right. So while you're getting mic'd up, let me, by the way, I'm sorry I'm not appropriately dressed because I had a car incident this morning and everything's okay, but I drive an American car, by the way. Yeah, just wanted you to know that. I want to focus on politics for a while. We've talked a lot about policy. We've talked about elasticities and parameters. I don't want us to be sitting here, and I know you don't either, 26 years from now and having a similar discussion. What needs to happen for us to get this child allowance idea out of the think tanks, out of the conferences, and into legislation that has real legs? And let me just say, before you answer, that it feels to me like the politics, I mean, you live this every day, but I am a denizen of this town. It feels to me like, if anything, the politics have been going the wrong way in that regard.
Well, you know, it is. It is about the political will to turn this around. But I go back to something that I said, and someone got up and talked about it was a Feeding America, and FRAC is represented here. You take a look at some of the policies that we have today. When people like George McGovern and Bob Dole got together, and Kennedy and Leahy and Schweikert and Javits, et cetera, these are folks who understood that we had a national problem, and this was related in this instance to nutrition and hunger in the United States. So they came together and they said, what direction will this nation take as we move forward? Because it is a singular, critical issue for us to focus on. And they came up with, and today we do have school lunch programs. We do have a WIC program. We have, I continue to call it the food stamp program. And albeit these are under assault, but nevertheless, there were people who believed that the problem was so grave that we had to do something, and they understood the reason why they came to the Congress, which was to be able to put partisan politics aside, but to focus on the issue. Okay, that being said, I mentioned in my remarks the earned income tax credit. If you take a look at the years in which the EITC, when it began, I guess it was in '75, it was expanded over the years. If you look at that and under what administrations they occurred, they were Democrats and there were Republicans who felt that this was a way to raise people out of poverty.
But let me interject right here, because you're on a roll. I don't want to stop you, but let me interject that the connection between the EITC and work is, of course, at the core of the political successes you're stressing. By taking that connection out in a child allowance, do we cut its political legs off in that regard?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that someone said it earlier. You know, look, my focus is on well, the child tax credit as well. I talked about it, Newt Gingrich proposed it in a contract with America, and Bill Clinton signed it. But the children should not have to be penalized for what their circumstances of their household. And the issue, the critical issue, is child poverty in this country, which is a crisis. It is grinding, and you can't walk away from it, which, as I said, there has been an indifference to it. So that what are the ways, and there's so much research that's out there, there is data that comes from overseas as well, where the programs are working. They are lifting people out of poverty overseas. They could do that here, and it doesn't have to have, look, we want to encourage people to work, and I take issue. I have to just say this to you, Jared. I find it offensive when people tell me that folks do not want to work. We are defined by our jobs.
I agree.
And people want to work, whether you're a single mom or a single dad or so forth. There, maybe a small percentage somewhere, but people want a job to take care of their families. And they have fallen on difficult times. And that's what the problem is.
Yeah, I've worked with rich people and poor people, and I can't say that the lazy people I've met have all been poor. So let me leave it at that. But this is a very cold, kind of calculated political question. If we have, a policy of the type we're talking about here, and you have to get a majority in the House to vote for it, it would seem to me that disconnecting it from work would make that a heavier lift. Is that wrong?
Well, look, I think that it's not wrong. No, but I think you can have the discussion about it and what the value of it is, and that could be it can be a good discussion to have around the issue.
Your proposal, has it been costed out? What
No, but these programs are they're expensive. We know that. But I'm looking at an increase of $84 billion in a $84 billion for a defense budget in the 2018 budget. I'm looking at the 2017 budget that has an additional $12.5 billion for defense in it. I think we need to take a look at what the nature of the issue is, the nature of the problem, and what we want to do to get families back on track economically and do something about reducing child poverty.
So in terms of pay-fors, you just sort of tick through some of them. Is that kind of where you're coming from?
Well, I would take a look. Yeah, we have to cost it out, and we have to look at it. But it depends on what your priorities are. And if we do not look at this issue, and we don't look at what's happening with families today, and look at ways in which we can assist the process, whether we're dealing with the social safety net issues. By the way, there's a great article, I think it was Neil Irwin who just put it out, who talked about some of the social safety net programs of encouraging work. These are programs that help to encourage people to go to work, and it is, in fact, the case. But we also, and I guess it was Robert who mentioned, I'll take a look at the budget and for 2018, or at least the skinny budget, and look at it where what we have done is they are going to cut job training, worker opportunities. We cut back drastically on apprentice programs. We were up into the billions of dollars. Now there is $92 million for the United States to engage in apprenticeship program. It's a large number, but in terms of our budget, it is not a large number.
Yeah, and that is a program that's been shown to have really pretty impressive effects when it's done right. And I know the work of Harry Holzer and Bob Lehrman, and I think there's probably some bipartisan energy behind that. Let's talk a little bit about jobs and wages, because I do think that there is a problem in some of this debate where conservatives kind of assume that the reason poor people aren't working is because they don't want jobs and ignore the demand side of the equation. So let's talk a little bit about that. What do you think we need to do? You argued very, I think, powerfully, and to me it's persuasive, that most people want to work in no small part because they can't get by on the numbers we're talking about today. And so what do we need to do to increase the availability and the opportunity of good, remunerative, gainful employment for the kinds of folks we're worried about here?
I think you take a look at it. There are two sides of the equation, because I said, and I believe this, that the biggest economic challenge we have are people in jobs that just don't pay them enough money. So how do we address the issue? On longer term efforts, you're looking at education, job training, ways in which you help to, look, in Connecticut today I'm reading articles that in the aerospace industry there are jobs, but we don't have people who have the...
So the demand is solid, the supply side is...
Well, in this instance, that's the case. And so what are we doing to address the supply side of that effort? Something I have worked on since 1997 is rebuilding our infrastructure in this country. And I was actually waiting to see what's happening with the new administration on infrastructure, of where that will carry us. But I introduced a National Infrastructure Bank in 1997, and it's just not transportation. It's environmental infrastructure, energy, telecommunications. There are all manner of jobs there to look at. The Pew, along with the Markle Foundation, just issued a report talking about jobs in the digital economy, about how we can help people gain the training that we need. There are any manner of ideas out there that can move us to creating jobs. As a matter of fact, as you know, we are going to have a panel in the House of Representatives. I co-chair the Steering and Policy Committee, and the Democrats are going to do a panel on jobs. I mentioned infrastructure. I believe that our trade agreements have, in many instances, resulted in a loss of job and a loss of wages. So I think we need to look at those agreements and how we try to create jobs and increase wages, good paying jobs.
Let me interject two ideas here and get your take on them. One is a subsidized job program, which again, I'm getting some vibrations that conservatives are a little more open to this idea. During the Recovery Act, I know you know this because you were part of the idea, was we had under TANF Emergency Fund, an allowable expenditure, or subsidized job slots, which subsidized employment up to 80–90% of the wage for a time-limited period. It might be 3 months, it might be 6 months. My impression, and that of some, I think, pretty rigorous evaluations, was that worked well. So talk about what you think, whether subsidized employment is part of the solution here in terms of labor demand at the low end, and also minimum wages, increasing the minimum wage. There's a new proposal that we're about to hear about. I think Bobby Scott and Keith Ellison have, and in the Senate, Patty Murray and Bernie Sanders have a new minimum wage proposal, $15 an hour, phased in by 2024. So that's pretty bold, I think. Talk about those ideas and how they fit into this picture.
Well, I think both. I think the increase in the minimum wage, and I'll add a couple of things to this, which I think fit into the equation as well, is increasing the minimum wage. And I'm signed on to the Scott Ellison legislation I think we have to move in that direction. I've always been a proponent of increasing the minimum wage. And with regard to women, we're looking at 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. Yeah. Strong proponent. I believe that part of our equation is equal pay for equal work. Men and women in the same job deserve the same pay. I think that is an effort. So I'm foursquare down that road. I think that program was successful. That came out of the recovery program. I'm not sure we used it to the fullest extent possible.
It ended sooner than many of us would have liked.
Would like to have,
including some Republicans.
Yeah. So I mean, governors. Look, I think that those are the kinds of efforts that we ought to pursue. It shouldn't create a divide, but rather an opportunity. The way the conversations have been held in the past about trying to come to a conclusion about how you do this. But there are also, I mean, in terms of that economic, I talked short-term education and infrastructure. On the other side of it, there are some short-term ways in which we can help to assist families. And that is with minimum wage, it is with pay equity, it is with the cost of childcare. It's paid sick days, it's paid family leave. And you know what the interesting time is? There may be people in the audience who say, "Oh my God, we're off in the fringes here." No, they were part of the debate in the presidential election, and I talked to, and they're still part of the debate. But the tax credit idea, Marco Rubio, Mike Lee, these are people who are looking at these efforts as potential realities.
I did notice that it looked like, again, Trump's outline is hardly a plan, but it did seem that the Ivanka Care proposal kind of morphed a little bit into something that was, maybe not quite so favorable to those at the top by extending a child care dependent tax credit, but that's not refundable, so it lacks some of the saliency that we're talking about today. I think we should move to the audience for some questions. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, great.
It's also, I would just say on that program, and I'm waiting to see what the details are on the Ivanka Trump program, but it only now applies to mothers and not to for fathers. So, I mean, there's some work that has to get done.
True that, yeah.
Hi, my name is Melissa Boteach at the Center for American Progress. Thank you so much for your leadership and your work on these issues. My question is sort of about building the political and public will. You've noted in your remarks that 70% of the middle class squeeze is attributable to child-related costs. We've seen this sort of deep vein of populism, economic populism, in this country in the past couple of months and years. And I'm wondering, given that your proposal goes, phases out with the regular child tax credit, is there a way to, in addition to, I think we are all in favor of the cutting poverty components of the young child tax credit, but given that there's so much income volatility and that the poor are not a stagnant class, people are moving in and out, but may not identify as poor per se, are there ways to help people, including, weak Trump voters or people in rural areas who are not as familiar with this, to educate them on the benefits of this kind of allowance, particularly since you noted it's going to disproportionately help people in rural counties as well?
Well, I think you've hit on something. I think people are really, there is desperation out there. We talk about people who feel invisible, people who they don't look to Washington because they feel a sense that nothing is happening here that will affect their lives. And I will speak as I'll speak as a Democrat. I think it's imperative for us to reconnect, to engage, to look at what is going on in the lives of working Americans, and to talk about, because there are overwhelming numbers of support for paid sick days, for paid family leave, for child care. In my state of Connecticut, it's $15,000 to $18,000 a year for child care. People just cannot afford it. But it's tough to get through to people because they haven't heard us talking about it. And there's no sense that we walk in their shoes and the lives that they are leading and what we need to do. So I think there is great possibility for us to engage in that kind of a conversation all over the country with people who, there may not be the diehard Trump supporters who are there, but there are certainly enough of those folks who voted because they were looking for change or because they heard an economic message. And it remains to be seen whether that will materialize, but I will speak from my point of view as I think we have to be out there talking to them about that, not here in Washington, D.C., talking to each other or fighting with one another.
Let me just hitchhike on that for a second. One could imagine taking what you just said, Melissa's question, and building a platform for Democrats to run on with child allowance. I mean, I've heard Medicare for all, job guarantee, big ideas that really deliver, on this populist promise in a way that certainly, tax cuts for rich people and getting rid of the ACA doesn't. Is that the way we ought to be thinking about this?
Yeah. We ought to be thinking big. We ought to make proposals that have a very big impact on people's lives. That's why I mean, child tax credit is, a big.
But let me ask you a critical. I think it's a critical question. So, would moderate Democrats get on that?
Yes,
on that platform?
I believe they will. I believe they will. I do.
Other questions? What about any of the authors of the papers, Sam or Chris or Jane? Any? Sam, did you? Anything you want to ask about? Sorry.
I'll just make a couple comments. It was mentioned earlier, I think in Robert's remarks, that Republicans might support something if you can construe it as a form of tax relief, and that historically is how the child tax credit came about. And even in Hillary's expansion, which she proposed on the campaign, was as a form of tax relief. I want to know your opinions as a congresswoman about that framing, and if it's problematic in your eyes, or if the compromise it makes to getting something passed is worth it, or if it's meant that we've sacrificed doing something that actually reaches the lowest of the distribution.
Good question.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really is not what you call it, but what it is. And we can figure out, how to define it so that you're looking at how you build that coalition to move it forward. But what is it? And is it going to reach to the level of folks who need to be able to take advantage of it and whose lives can be changed by it? For me, it is about the details of what it is that we're doing, how penetrable it is to the problem that we are looking at, and if we can build a coalition around the goal of what the program is, and then everybody can figure out a way in which they can define it, for themselves or for their constituents, or so forth. That's the way I view that.
Any further questions? If not, Ron, you want to? Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Rosa.
Thank you.